I'm here today to present on my capstone, which is titled The Missing Pieces of the Carbon Story. A little bit about myself. I'm Julia. I'm a Brazilian MBA E-IPER. I'm an author. I've spent a couple of years in climate advocacy and also structured finance. So I experience a little bit all over the place. The problem statement that I wanted to work on was really that so many of the climate solutions that we're spending time on and hoping towards for our Paris climate goal are scientific or technological. But there are a number of them, in fact, that are enabling frameworks that allow us to get those things done. Those enabling frameworks, like carbon accounting or carbon markets, in my view, help bind the rest. They are the glue. So getting the glue right is pretty mission critical in my view. Yet today, there are gaping holes in these frameworks, and we're not talking about them enough. So for my capstone, I wrote 3 op-eds. The first, which is what I'm going to spend time talking about today, because it would be impossible to talk about all 3, is Scope 3 and how it disincentivizes decarbonization. The second one is talking about what's wrong with Scope 2. And the third looks at the voluntary carbon markets and whether they function more like commodity or bond markets. I guess the first question that's worth answering is why write? 3 main reasons for that in my view. The first is that we are building the plane as we fly it in climate. So we can't really rely on the same ways that we've passed on information in the past of kind of having decade-long cycles of information through academia, education, policy, et cetera. Information needs to be a lot faster and a lot more efficient. And to that point, if we look at some data on climate newsletters, for example, you see that there is a 70% open rate on those types of medium compared to 20% for all other industries. So I think that just goes to show how much people are demanding this type of information in kind of a quick and easy way. And the third, and this came out of my research, is that op-eds do seem to change opinions, and this proves both across political spectrum and at a wide range of topics. But I suppose one risk here from my approach is that we're not really sure if those changed opinions actually change behavior. So one thing to flag. My goals and really the call to action with the 3 articles, and a little bit today during the presentation, is first to cast doubt and provoke good questions on the current systems that we're using. This is obviously hard to measure. I wanted to just highlight that. Second is to increase traffic to the Stanford Sustainable Finance Initiative. Alicia Seiger has been my advisor in this, and they've done tremendous work in thinking about alternative, robust systems. And third, hopefully promoting the testing of those alternative frameworks. So before I get into the first article, I really wanted to just define a couple of key terms. I think everyone here in the room probably knows them, but it's worth speeding through. The first is that the greenhouse gas protocol has been around for roughly 20 years. 90% of Fortune 500 companies use the greenhouse gas protocol, and it effectively divides the world into Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. So Scope 1 are your direct emissions. Think of a facility that a company may own. Scope 2 is the energy provided to that facility, and Scope 3 are supply chain upstream and downstream indirect emissions. If we look at the breakup of where these emissions actually fall, how much of emissions fall in Scope 1, 2, and 3, you see that the majority is actually in Scope 3. So if we're going to make any meaningful impact in terms of decarbonization, we really have to understand how we're going to tackle Scope 3. So when we talk about Scope 3, many people have focused their attention on the lack of data, but little has been talked about incentives. Incentives are super important because we're looking at what many people describe as the largest capital reallocation in history. And so for that money to move, incentives have to make sense. So let's take an example. Here I'm using an example of a company like Nike that has some of these net zero commitments, wants to reduce its Scope 3 emissions. It has a factory where it produces its shoes, and it buys from a cotton farmer that is its Scope 3. That cotton farmer also provides material to 3 other factories in the system. So let's say Nike decides it wants to finance decarbonization at the level of the cotton farmer and reduce emissions by 50%. Great. What also happens is that while Nike gets that 50% emissions benefit at their factory, so do all the other factories that buy from that cotton farmer. So this starts to show a little bit of the problem that Nike is paying for something that other people will benefit from. This problem gets even worse when we think about the outside supply chain problem. So in this case, the greenhouse gas protocol uses the norm today has become market averages. So effectively, even people that buy from a different cotton farmer that didn't do anything at all, they get a benefit, a weighted benefit of those emissions reductions that Nike has financed. This is obviously perfect for greenwashing. You don't need to do anything, but you can claim lower emissions, and is an example of a type of free rider problem that in economics we describe as a type of market failure. Effectively, when this happens, people choose not to invest. There are a couple of solutions to this. So the first is really thinking about e-liabilities and emissions liability management. The e-liability method was invented really by two professors, one from Harvard, one from Oxford, that tried to think about emissions more from the perspective of cost accounting. So in the same way that a product from a raw material all the way to a final product accumulates cost on the way, it can also accumulate emissions on the way. If we think about using an e-liability approach, then suddenly we don't use market averages and we get rid of the outside supply chain problem. If we think about emissions liability management, which is where the Stanford Sustainable Finance Initiative really leads a lot of research here, then we also see a solution to the incentive problem. So ELM tries to, in the same way that we think about corporate balance sheets having assets and liabilities, think about carbon balance sheets having carbon assets and carbon liabilities, and that this gives us a meaningful message to the carbon solvency of the company. So if we go back to our initial example, the status quo today is that Nike doesn't really get any benefit from, having financed those lower emissions at the cotton farmer. But in a world of ELM, and these are just examples, numbers to illustrate, they would indeed get a benefit for having financed those emissions reductions, making it make sense for them. And in that way, solving the incentive problem. So here I've provided QR code. If you're not familiar with the SFI yet, you should be. I think they're doing incredible work in this space. And finally, to conclude, so many of our climate solutions depend on complex scientific and technological advancements that will take the brightest minds years to solve. It really shouldn't be the case that an incentive problem or a poor accounting system takes the same, especially when we have clear alternative. So the message here is let's fix the glue. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Julia. You pointed out some really significant issues with the way that Scope 3 emissions are defined today. So why is it that those haven't changed in the past, and why are they still persisting?
Yeah, I think it's really a couple of reasons. So the first thing is that the system, as you guys saw, really allows a huge flexibility and space for greenwashing. And whether we like it or not, for a lot of companies, it's been to date a lot easier to just claim that they're doing something rather than doing something. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The second element is that part of using some of these market averages, it basically means that bad money drives out good. So what do I mean by that? If someone actually wants to have accurate emissions reporting, they incur a cost that if they just use market averages, they don't. So it's another element of the incentive problem that you're not actually incentivizing people to get to the right information because today you're treating everyone the same. So I think that's super important. And then I think a third element maybe is Scope 3 looks at upstream and downstream emissions. And so because downstream emissions are so much harder, I think a lot of people just kind of say, look, we'll just do a big market average and whatever, because all of this is just too hard.
Thank you, Julia, for a wonderful presentation. You mentioned that the output of your research will be 3 articles. Can you just elaborate more what success of that looks like? Where would you like to publish? Who do you intend to reach? And how many people do you ideally hope to read your research?
Yeah, great, thank you. So the pilot of this little project actually happened over the summer, where I wrote an article for the SFI that was published in My Climate Journey. My Climate Journey has upwards of 30,000 readers, and again, falls into that high readership bucket. So I'm looking at publications like CTVC, My Climate Journey, GreenBiz. I think those are the main ones. But for me, almost what's more important is that if I think about kind of the main actors that really have to think about this, I would almost start with some of the startups that have raised significant amount of money today trying to do carbon accounting, and I have relationships at all of those, so I would hope that they would be kind of the first point of contact to see in what ways you can fix the current system from within, so to speak.
Great presentation. You had the data point that op-eds change opinions but don't change behaviors. This is total kind of tangent question, but I'm curious, what do you think the way to change consumers' behaviors is if it's not by or in addition to changing opinions?
Yeah. The finding of the research was not definitely that it doesn't change behaviors. It's just that there's no research that actually takes the second step from saying op-eds have changed opinions and also changed behaviors. I think that's also a harder thing to measure. But I think behavioral change is really hard. And in a space like this, when we think about traditional accounting or the traditional frameworks of how these things have come to pass, a lot of that is like public policy and kind of rule setting at a multilateral level that maybe doesn't require behavior change from like the normal person.
Try not to ask any questions, but just a comment, I think, on the why did this system persist. I think for most of the 20 years, it was actually used internally. So then either a company that was well-intended would figure out how to become more sustainable or engage in greenwashing. I think the new thing in paying homage to the COP that's going on right now is now we're starting to rely on commitments made by corporations, and those have to add up globally. So it's like an even bigger problem. It's a problem when a lot of people do greenwashing, but an even bigger problem, part of the commitments we're relying on are the corporate ones, which seem to be growing every year. So I think that's just more motivation for what you've done here.
Yeah. If I can add to that, in the actual article, there's a whole section where the GHG protocol came about as a risk management tool and not as a carbon accounting one. And so like what actually happens when you try and turn a risk management tool into an accounting one, and this is a little bit the result. So it worked very well as a risk management tool.
Totally. Yeah.